and they're asking the Ukrainians to give up territory to Russia that Ukraine controls. Russia does not fully control the 4 areas that they claim to have annexed. And they're demanding, yes, that Ukraine never join NATO, that it reduce the size of its army, and essentially they're still hoping that there can be regime change in Kyiv. The Ukrainians have understood that they may have to temporarily accept the loss of some of the territories that Russia occupies, but they're clearly not going to give in to these maximalist demands. So unless the Russians are willing to meet the Ukrainians to really truly negotiate, then this war is going to go on, and there is going to not even be a 30-day ceasefire.
And we've heard Russia and Ukraine have failed to agree a ceasefire after a second round of peace talks in Istanbul. The Kremlin says it suggested a 2 to 3 day pause in some areas, but Ukraine accused them of rejecting the initial offer of a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. The 2 delegations did accept a new prisoner exchange for those who are under 25, ill or heavily wounded. Speaking after the talks, Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Kyslytsya, appeared to blame Russia for the lack of progress.
We asked them directly if they were ready to react to our proposals that we handed over to them in written form. A while ago, there was no follow-up on the Russian side. As you can understand, we could not react to the Russian proposals because the Russian proposals were only literally given to us during the meeting. Therefore, the Russians themselves suggested that we need to take a serious look at those proposals.
Well, President Zelensky's also spoken. He's in Lithuania meeting Baltic and Nordic allies, and he spoke of Ukraine's continued ambition to join NATO.
Geopolitical gains are just as important to Russia as money or territory. If Putin is allowed to decide who joins NATO, where NATO infrastructure can or can't be, then Russia's appetite for war will only grow. Our shared goal is the opposite, to completely end Russia's hunger for aggression.
Well, Angela Stent is a former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia and a former senior NATO advisor. Good evening to you, Angela.
Good evening.
Really good to have you with us. It does seem as though Russia and Ukraine are as far apart as ever.
Oh, they certainly are. I mean, Putin only agreed to negotiations after he was worried that President Trump, who at that point agreed with the 4 European coalition of the willing leaders who'd been in Kiev, that he agreed that if Russia didn't do something, he would impose very tough sanctions. So the Russians are doing this to forestall any actions, further actions that the US might take against Russia. The Ukrainians are doing it, obviously, because they would like to have a 30-day ceasefire. They've incurred large losses, as have the Russians. But of course, the two sides are completely far apart in what they are prepared to accept. And Putin's maximalist demands haven't changed from, before Trump became president.
Yeah, Russia does not appear to have given any ground whatsoever. I mean, the Ukrainians did agree to the US suggestion of a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Russia has put out this idea of 2 or 3 days, which presumably would not amount to a great deal. But it's also continuing its demands, isn't it, for full control of all the those 4 provinces of Ukraine, which are partially occupied by its forces, and that demand that Ukraine would never join NATO.
Yes, and they're asking the Ukrainians to give up territory to Russia that Ukraine controls. Russia does not fully control the 4 areas that they claim to have annexed. And they're demanding, yes, that Ukraine never join NATO, that it reduce the size of its army. And essentially, they're still hoping that there can be regime change in Kyiv. The Ukrainians have understood that they may have to temporarily accept the loss of some of the territories that Russia occupies, but they're clearly not going to give in to these maximalist demands. So unless the Russians are willing to meet the Ukrainians to really truly negotiate, then this war is going to go on, and there is going to not even be a 30-day ceasefire.
And we've heard President Trump suggest that Russia could face further heavy sanctions. He said, we'll soon find out if President Putin is stringing us along. I mean, it seems patently evident to everybody else that that's exactly what President Putin is doing. I mean, what do you think President Trump's next move is going to be? An impossible question, I know, Angela.
Well, the Senate has a bill ready, supported by 81 senators, bipartisan, which means it's veto-proof. So if the president vetoed it, they could override the veto. And it's a very tough sanctions bill, including 500% tariffs on countries that continue to trade oil with Russia. They could vote on this bill this week. We had two US senators in Kiev over the weekend who said that the bill was ready. They're the co-sponsors, but so far they haven't done anything. I think they're still waiting for President Trump to okay this. So we've heard from President Trump time and time again, if the Russians don't do something in 2 weeks, I will do something, and nothing has happened. So it remains to be seen. And the other option is that President Trump will say, as he has hinted, and the Secretary of State Rubio has hinted, that he'll just kind of walk away from the talks if neither side is willing to really negotiate seriously.
And this all comes after those extraordinary Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian air bases thousands of miles from Ukraine's border. I mean, what do you make of the scale of those attacks?
Well, it's quite an amazing operation, meticulously planned over a year, as President Zelensky has said, including the drones being fired from Russian territory. There clearly were sleeper agents in Russia that were organizing this. And as you say, they reached as far as Siberia, thousands of miles away from Ukraine. So this war is a mixture of sort of World War I trench warfare and very high-tech 21st century warfare. It's quite amazing what they accomplished. And the 41 bombers that they demolished and burnt are in fact all Soviet-era planes, and they can't be replaced. The Russians don't manufacture them anymore. So it'll take Russia some time to replace those planes. And I think what the Ukrainians have shown, contrary to what was told to them in the disastrous meeting in the Oval Office in February, they do have cards to play, and they just played a very impressive card.
And do you think that that was part of the objective of this, for President Zelensky and those around him to say, look, we're not beaten. It's not all going Russia's way, even though Russia has been making small, gradual gains?
Yes, I think that was really the objective. I mean, Russia has been taking a bit more territory in the past few months, a very considerable loss of life. The Ukrainians have been pushed back largely from the Kursk area in Russia, which they occupied last year. But I think it's a way of showing, and I think that's a reality, Ukraine isn't beaten. It's gotten very good at this kind of drone and electronic warfare. Those drones were manufactured in Ukraine. They're not using NATO drones to do this. And I think it's to remind the Russians that this is not an easy win, and the Russians really haven't made that much progress in the past year.
Do you think that it is possible that Ukraine, with continued backing from its allies, perhaps not the United States, but European countries stepping up their spending and their commitments on defence, could actually continue to inflict real damage on Russia, could actually turn the tide in this war?
I don't know whether it can turn the tide in this war. And I think in the absence of American weapons and support, and the Trump administration has not made any move to renew support for Ukraine or to provide it with weapons unless it buys them, it's going to be very difficult. Of course, Europe is stepping up. It's going to selling more weapons. The Germans will probably even finally sell or provide Ukraine with the Taurus missiles. But still, that might not be enough really to push the Russians that far back. But the Ukrainians can certainly continue to fight back. And at some point, the Russians might decide that they have to be willing to moderate some of the demands. But I believe that will really only happen if there are much tougher sanctions on Russia. And even that, will inflict some damage, but maybe not enough. But also, really, it does have to have the United States redoubling its military support for Ukraine.
Interesting that today Ukraine handed Russia a list of kidnapped children at these peace talks. Apparently, the negotiators handed their Russian counterparts a list of hundreds of children who've been kidnapped and forcibly taken to Russia. We've seen some kind of agreement on an exchange of prisoners, but not apparently these children. I mean, this is an aspect of this war that we very rarely hear much about.
Yes, well, by the way, according to the Yale Center that has been studying this for the past 3 years, there are 19,000 Ukrainian children that have been removed from Ukraine, many of them forcibly adopted in Russia, attempting to Russify them. And we now understand that they're going to be sending children from the occupied areas of Ukraine, occupied by Russia, back into Russia. Don't forget that's the reason why Putin was indicted as a war criminal a few years ago. It had to do with the abduction, the forced abduction and adoption of Ukrainian children. And I think it's a very important aspect. And it's unfortunate that it's really absent from the news because the human scale of suffering there is really terrible.
One of our listeners has got in touch questioning about this idea of, it's Chris, questioning about this idea of seizing Russian assets to pay for more support for Ukraine in the war. That's an idea that seems to have been floating around for quite a while. We've seized millions of pounds and dollars worth of Russian assets since the war began. What about that idea of using that in order to fund Ukraine's defences?
So there's $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets, and there has been a very lively argument going on among European countries, because most of these are in Europe. They're not really very many in the United States. So there's some countries and some organizations question the legality of it or the precedent it might send. So that if you seize the Russian assets, what about in future times other countries seizing, Western assets? That, as I say, that debate's going on. I think that there's been an agreement in the EU, and I think in the G7 too, to use proceeds from the interest on these frozen assets. But I'm not sure whether there will ever be agreement among the Western countries that it's okay to do that.
Angela Stent, former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia and a former senior NATO advisor. It's been great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carl.